the information that I can provide is with regard to the most recent developments, and the most urgent issue is this decision by the government on the 11th of September this year, so a very short time ago, a little more than a month ago, to approve a program that puts an end to many of the hopes of the Bedouin in the Negev desert to recognition. Thank you. But just before I start going into that, just so we understand the area that we're talking about, and just a tiny bit of the background of what geographical place we're in. So this is the southern part of what is now Israel. It's the Naqab desert, or the Negev desert in Hebrew, and to its west is the Sinai desert, which is now Egypt. And that's actually a contiguous area, okay? And historically, the tribes that Mansour was describing before moved freely between these areas. And within the Negev desert, there was a distribution among tribes of ownership, and this map is actually a translation into Hebrew of a map that Mansour was mentioning, an Al-Araqib map, a map by the person who was an administrator of this area before the founding of the State of Israel. It shows the distribution among the tribes. Before 1948, Dr. Awad Abu Frech will give more detail on this later, but before the founding of the state, there were over 100,000 people living there. And in 1948, the majority were pushed out, were expelled, leaving only about 11,000. In the years following that, the Bedouin who remained in that area were concentrated. They were moved from all of the area of the Negev desert into a very specific region. Now I hope I have this right. Yeah. Okay, so you can see that circle with the little thing sticking out of it on the northwest. That was what was called the area of containment, in Hebrew, siag, to which the Bedouin were constrained. Within that area today, there are about 90,000 people, and again, I may be not precise with my details, so I trust Dr. Abu Frech to correct me later, around 90,000 people who were constrained to townships that were built specifically for them, and another 90,000 or so who live in villages what the state considers unrecognized and doesn't mark on any map. About 10 of those villages are in various, or were in various processes of recognition until the time that I'm going to be talking about, and the rest, and that's several tens of thousands of people live without access to services at all as a form of pressure by the state. So the state wants them to move into designated areas in order to be able to develop it for the Jewish community, in order to be able to control them better, and in order to force them to do so, denies them basic things like infrastructure, running water for drinking, electricity, health services, equality in education services, etc. Now, why do I say that the Paravel report puts an end to hopes? Because over the past 20 years or so, there has been a lot of activism on the part of the Bedouin communities, as well as some Jewish Israeli groups, in a struggle for recognition, political recognition, human rights recognition, civil rights, infrastructure recognition, and where the government refused to allow the Bedouin communities representation. Bedouin communities made their own representation and made a noise, made legal work, campaigning, etc. And the result of that is that piecemeal, in small details, there had been some steps forward in that when I said 10 villages are in some sort of a process of recognition. And so people were under the impression that it was worth it to struggle, as it were. And in court cases brought about the founding of clinics, the founding of schools, which had not been there before. And then in the next stage in all of this was that in 2007, the government appointed a commission headed by retired Justice Goldberg. And the idea of this commission was to hear evidence from the Bedouin communities as well as from the government and others, and to try to give an overall response to the issue, the problem, to solve the problem of the Bedouin. This is how it's seen in Israeli government discourse. The Goldberg Commission did open its doors to the communities, so that there was a lot of evidence provided by civil society, by experts from the community, by people from the community who said what they thought should be in justice. And in the end of 2008, the Goldberg Commission published its report. Now, it's not a perfect report. Its key problem probably was saying that the Bedouin have no ownership rights over the land. And this, I think, is one of the reasons why Dr. Mansour, who was talking before, was providing you with all the details to show how wrong that conclusion is. But on the other hand, it did say that the Israeli government had treated Bedouin unjustly, inappropriately over all of the years, and that there should be a recognition of the historical ties of the Bedouin to the land. Another problem with the Goldberg, that was another presentation. Another problem with the Goldberg Commission's conclusions was that it imposed, it sort of opened the door for imposing conditions. So not to say that every village should necessarily be recognized because it's already there, but there should be a minimum of a certain number of people, or there should be something that they called municipal fitness. Now, these are conditions which are not placed before Jewish settlers. On the contrary, there was a law passed for the specifically Jewish settlement of the Negev, in which you can have a single family or even individual running a gigantic big ranch. And the idea there, in order to counter what was considered by the government the Bedouin threat. Okay, this is all couched in these very nationalist terms. It's important to know in what context this takes place. But it was an opening. The Goldberg, I'm going to keep doing this, the Goldberg Committee did involve the community. The next stage was the moment at which everything sort of goes down the drain, as it were, because then the government said, we now need to implement the Goldberg Committee's recommendations. And they set up another committee headed by a man called Ehud Pravel, or Udi Pravel, who works for the Prime Minister's office, and gave him the mandate to translate this sort of academic sort of text into an implementation plan. What to do, in fact, to solve all the problem of the Bedouin. That was 2009. And then earlier this year, several months ago, the first report started coming out, drafts, rumors, media reports about what was actually inside this report, what was inside the Pravel report. And starting from the very bottom line, what the Pravel report meant was that of the up to 90,000 people who would be affected, around 30,000 would be evicted from their homes, would be displaced, their homes would be destroyed, and they would be sent to another place. And this was a sort of point-blank decision. It goes into a lot of detail. It's a very detailed report, but the basics is based on a regional master plan that was made for Beersheba, which talked about some villages, 11 being recognized where they were, another 6 being recognized partly and partly evicted, and then the rest, the other 20, basically being evicted in various ways, either to these townships or to other recognized villages. And in any case, when there's a smaller village, dispersed, they call it, it would be sort of gathered into a bigger village. And this is, it's important to say this is all counter to the way that these communities live. The ties to the land are very direct, very long, very real, and so any change completely disrupts the system of ownership that Mansour was describing before. Now, what was interesting was the response in the Israeli public and in the Israeli government, because the Pravel report, which I just mentioned now, was not strong enough for them. And in fact, the right wing in the Israeli public and also in the government said, do you mean that the rest are going to be recognized? Do you mean you're going to be giving them dunams and dunams of land, okay, hectares of land? They don't deserve this. That means that you're recognizing that they have ownership, but they don't have ownership. And so the report was given back to the government into discussion. And then what finally happened on the 11th of September this year, was an amendment to the Pravel report, which was amended by Amidror, former General Amidror, whom Christian mentioned before. And that makes crystal clear that the very basis of anything to do with Bedouin comes from a premise that there is no right to ownership for the Bedouin. The Bedouin own no land, have no right to own land, and anything that is given to them is given as a privilege, as a favor, as because they're being nice. And the bulk of, it's important to know that the bulk of the report, as amended, deals with ownership claims, but not in order to give people the right to stay on their land, but in order to figure out how much compensation they will receive in money or in land in return for being evicted. And so out of the 64 pages of this report, the vast majority is given over to compensation mechanisms. So it's lots of details about compensation without saying the bottom line, and the bottom line is eviction, displacement, yet again. And this is not something new. I mean, Al-Araqib is happening now, and when you heard Mansour talking about a displacement of 5,000 people in 1983, who heard about that at all? I mean, in this room, probably it was new. It's something that happens again and again, piecemeal, small, but this time it'll be something very big in one moment. So the biggest mass displacement since the founding of the State of Israel, since 1948. I'll just sort of go a little tiny bit into the detail before stopping. I don't know how much time I still have. 1 minute. 2, okay. So I already said that the basis is, the premise, the legal premise is a legal opinion provided by a woman called Ms. Sarit Dana on behalf of the government, saying that the state's premise is no ownership rights. In addition, geographical limits. So I showed you before on the map this limitation. That limitation to be strictly respected. That means that even when people are evicted and then given land in return, none of that land can be outside that specific, very closed area. In fact, even a little bit more narrow than it is in that picture over there. And very specifically, nobody to be settled west of road number 40. Road number 40 is a road that goes north to south in the Negev and divides the east from the west. No Bedouin settlement in the west of the Negev, even though it's also their ancestral lands, and they have a right to live throughout wherever they like. It's a small community that wants to live in its own historic lands. On the issue of compensation, so we're talking about compensation of up to 50% of value. We're talking about a right to compensation only if Bedouin had registered their claim to ownership before 1979 with the Israeli authorities. And also it's restricted, there's a time limit. These claimants, they'll be given 9 months to confirm their claims, that is to give all the proof that they actually can claim the land. And after a period of time, it won't be possible to receive compensation at all according to the law. And it will be possible to go to court in order to contest the eviction, but in that case you don't get compensation, whatever the result is. Then enforcement is maybe the most interesting sentence in the entire report, which I will finish with, and listen to the irony of this. It's a quote: "The system of enforcement, or the law enforcement authorities, will operate decisively and vigorously to prevent new construction, as carrying out regulation procedures on the one hand and expanding illegal construction on the other cannot exist together." Now that's quite, if you're thinking about the situation, for example, of the settlements that are being built in the occupied territories, it's quite an ironic text to write on the part of the Israeli government saying, we'll be working very hard to destroy some of the buildings, and we definitely won't allow anyone to be building anything, because you can't plan a solution at the same time while people are making facts on the ground. So it sounds quite ironic. I'll stop here and let Dr. Awad Al-Boufreh talk. But at the bottom line, I'd like to say that the Bravel report is symbolic of a broader process that is happening in Israeli society, where in the past it was possible to have a sort of protest struggle process in which people tried and had some hope that their struggle might succeed on a smaller level, on a broader level. But something happened over the past few years, which has meant a very big change, not only in the government, also in society. And this is perhaps going to be the first example of the very concrete results of that process. Thank you.